Okay, so if nobody has any questions about the anything specific, I think I'd like to take this time to start working through an introduction to Torah Shebal Peh. Somebody's got an echo here. Um, the Oral Torah in general, the evolution and how we've arrived to where we are today, and more importantly, all the sources that we're going to meet along the way, what each one, the role that each one plays, and which place each one has in the evolution and um, in the whole history of the oral Torah. So it's kind of it's kind of an ad hoc. I'm not. I mean, I have a lot of different sources in my head. I'm kind of trying to build it as we go through history. Um, we're going to start at the beginning. We're going to start with the written Torah and Har Sinai, right? We know that Moshe Rabbeinu was given the Torah word for word, and we know that there are parts of the oral Torah that originated from those original conversations with Hashem. That there were mitzvahs that were given with a lot of detail. We see detail. There are certain mitzvot in the written Torah, right? In the Chumash, we can see, for instance, random example, Nigaim, right? Tzarat. There are all sorts of details about Tzarat. If it grows, if it shrinks, you have to go into isolation. You have to come out, and then the Kohen has to come and check. There are all these details about it. Another example is Nizikin, all these ideas about the animals causing damage. An oxen, goes and tramples the neighbor's crops or eats their crops, or goes and rams another animal. All those cases are kind of laid out in the Torah very specifically, but there are a lot of mitzvot where the Torah just tells us one word or half a sentence, and there's no way that that's sufficient to actually do anything with that information. For instance, um, two kind of classic examples that the Rambam brings is tefillin and sukkah. So tefillin, actually, the Torah gives us zero information. It just says totafot beinenecha, zikaron al yadecha, or ot al yadecha. Those are the two expressions by the tefillin go on the arm, and totafot beinenecha is what the tefillin shel rosh are always called. What does that mean? Right? So there are a lot of mitzvot like this, and sukkah also. It says sukkot ta'asu, shiva yamim teshvu basukot. You have to sit in the sukkah for 7 days, dwell in it. Beyond that, we don't have any information about what constitutes a sukkah. So there are some mitzvot that clearly were not intended to be the written version was not intended to be relied upon. So those things that clearly we have part of the um, part of the or the greater part of the halachot that come from them that are from the Torah were given over orally, and if it's something that can be connected to the text, somehow derived from the psukim, then it's considered to be quote unquote regular oral Torah. If it's something that is completely disconnected, it's kind of standalone. It's not based on any pasuk. That's what's known as halacha Moshe Sinai, concept that probably people are familiar with. Um, I've heard about halacha Moshe Sinai, right? Halacha Moshe Sinai. What does that mean? That means that's something that we know that was given in a way that it's not. There's no way to relate it to the written word. And most of these are originally recorded. The Rambam says originally only 20 halachot that were halacha Moshe Sinai, and I believe 9 of them are related to tefillin. Tefillin being the kind of ultimate example of a mitzvah that has a lot of details, but the Torah doesn't tell us any of them. So they were all given separately, orally, and since there's so little information in the Torah itself, there's no way to say, oh, if I read this carefully, I can understand how this could mean this. Like for the Sukkah, there are all sorts of things in the Gemara that are that they try to relate back to Psukim. It says, "Leman yid'u dorotechem ki b'tzut ki b'tzetchem b'mitzrayim ki yoshavti et b'nei Yisrael b'Sukkot." So the Torah has gives a little bit more information, and then there are all these halachot that the Chachamim try to connect to that pasuk of leman tid'u, leman yid'u dorotechem, that the generations should know that when you left Egypt, you were dwelling in Sukkot. That's it, an extra information that we can kind of try to derive things from. So those halachot that can be attached are not called halacha Moshe Sinai. Halacha Moshe Sinai is a specific class that's reserved for things that are standalone. That's kind of the beginning. We have a lot of different accounts or anecdotes from Chazal about halachot that were given to Moshe and to Yeshua, and we know that from the very beginning there was this oral Torah that was passed down and that was always being learned and relearned and deepened and broadened and expanded, starting from Moshe Rabbeinu and Yoshua ben Nun. Now, through the generations from Moshe Rabbeinu all the way up till the end of Beit Rishon, end of the first temple period, we don't have a lot of records of. There are a few mentions here and there of things that were instituted by David HaMelech, by Shlomo Melech, by some of the Nevi'im or the Shoftim, but there seems to have been not a great deal of development of the Oral Torah because there were Nevi'im around. So you can go to the Navi, and the Navi can tell you what you're supposed to do. They were also Chachamim, the Nevi'im. They were also well-learned. And if it's something specific, he'll tell you exactly what to do because he has this spiritual sight, the Navi. And sometimes he'll get a direct message from Hashem or some kind of direct indication of what you're supposed to do in that situation. So the Oral Torah was kind of we could say its growth was stunted in this first period. We don't have any books or works that were written or not written. Obviously, the Oral Torah wasn't written at all until after the Second Temple. But we don't have any works that were formulated. And in this period, there are hints here and there that there were certain things that were enacted. There are enactments. There are, for instance, the Aravot in Hoshana Rabbah at the end of all the Hakafot and Hoshana Rabbah. So we take the Aravot and we smack them on the floor. So that the Gemara records as being Minhag Nevi'im. It's something that the Nevi'im instituted. So that goes all the way back to the first Beis Hamikdash. We have a few things like that, but for the most part, we don't know much about the development, and it seems like the development was very gradual at that point. And because there were centralized institutions of Navi and Sanhedrin, the Oral Torah was kind of very monolithic. There was only one way of doing things. There may have been different minhagim, different shvatim, or different areas of Eretz Yisrael where they did things a little bit differently. But it wasn't like there was a the kind of different streams that we have today, like Sephardim do this, Ashkenazim do this, right? There were no breakoffs in that sense, and there were no splits because everything was still centralized. Now, this period ends. We start to see strong, identifiable figures who represent the power of Torah Shebal Peh. At the beginning of the Second Temple, we have Ezra and Nehemiah, and we have a lot more that we know about this period, about what was enacted and what kind of things were done, and the power of so-called rabbis. They weren't rabbis then; they were just leaders and chachamim. There was the designation was not given, right? Uh, the saying goes that the bigger rabbis are not called rabbi; they're just called Reb, like Reb Chaim Brisk, the Brisker Rebbe, right? He's called Reb Chaim. And of Rome, the Rosh Hashiva of Merkaz Rav, he was referred to as Reb of Rome. And the biggest rabbis, you don't even call them Reb. You just call them Ezra Hasofer, right? You just their name itself already, they're so well known, you don't even have to give them any title. So at that point in history, there were no official titles that we know of. Even the existence of an official, we don't even know the names of the Sanhedrin, the head of the Sanhedrin, for instance, before that period. That period is the first time where we know about things like who was on the Sanhedrin and such. So a few examples of things that we see that were enacted at the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. We're talking about the very beginning of the Second Temple, when just after the events that we read about in the Megillah and Purim, when the Second Temple was starting to be built, there was Shivat Zion, the first waves coming back from Babylon, back to Eretz Israel. Ezra led about 20,000 immigrants back from Bavel, back from Babylon, and the things that we see are, for instance, when Ezra came, there was a certain amount of intermarriage in Yerushalayim amongst the Jews that had stayed behind, that hadn't been exiled. And we see the first use of the power of Beit Din to control property, what's called Hefker Beit Din, which is a concept that that doesn't seem to have a it's not written in the Torah anywhere, right? That Beit Din has power over people's private possessions, but Beit Din has the power through this tool that's called Hefker Beit Din to relieve a person of their possessions, to strip them, confiscate their possessions. It becomes Hefker. If a person doesn't comply with the Beit Din, the Beit Din can use this as a tool of coercion, and that's what was done by Ezra and his Beit Din to those who didn't want to divorce their foreign wives. Their wives were idol worshippers. They hadn't converted, and Ezra said, anybody who doesn't divorce his wife, all of his property is Hefker. And so basically that took care of the problem. They all kicked out their wives who were worshiping idols, bringing idols into the house, and that was one of the first things that we see, the power of Beit Din, the power of Chachamim, and we see also that Nehemiah he put an end to doing business on Shabbos. So if we know, oh, you don't do business on Shabbos, where did that start? It's not in the Torah. In the Torah, there's nothing about, it's not one of the melachot on Shabbat, is doing business. It's not a melacha. a business agreement could be an oral agreement. It doesn't need to involve any malacha. Even the use of money, the use of currency on Shabbat is not from the Torah. So what happened was um, the shuk in Yerushalayim was active on Shabbos at that time. There would be people coming, going, buying and selling. And Nehemiah, who was sort of the political leader, Ezra was more of the spiritual leader. He said, "This is not acceptable. They've made Shabbos just like any other day. We need to take our Shabbos back." To shut down the shuk, he said, "No one's allowed to do business on Shabbos," and he shut the gates of the city so that people wouldn't be able to come and go. He locked the gates of the city on Shabbos. And the reasoning behind that, later on, we see the reasoning behind this, the kind of the basis of the prohibition for doing business on Shabbos is actually related to writing. Writing is a melacha, and any serious business transaction requires writing a contract or a receipt. And so that's the basis that the Chachamim in the Gemara say that was the basis of this gezerah, this takana that Nehemiah enacted. It also seemed to be just a provision to bring Shabbos back from being basically extinct because it didn't feel any different from any other day. So this is kind of where we see the dawn of the Oral Torah. Also, Ezra put together a Beit Din of 120 members, which was a basis for the Knesset in the modern day state of Israel when they decided to make the Knesset 120. They were basing that number on the Beit Din of Ezra and Nehemiah, also known as Anshe Knesset HaGdolah. The Knesset HaGdolah. Also, our parliament is called the Knesset, named after the Knesset HaGdolah. Knesset HaGdolah didn't have any Arab members in it, didn't have Muslims in it or Christians. It was all Jews. They were all Talmidei Chachamim. So maybe that's something that the founders of the state were hoping would happen one day. Hasn't happened yet, but we can look forward to it and pray for it. The Knesset HaGdolah was exceptional in a number of ways. First of all, we know from the Torah that the Sanhedrin, the High Court, right, has 70 members. There are all sorts of questions about it, 70 or 71. There's also the C, Beit Adin. Does he count? Is he one of the 70s or the 70th one, 71st? But certainly not any more than that. And 120 was kind of like there's no rule against it, but it had never been done before. And so it put them in a situation where they were able to enact things that nobody could challenge because it was the largest grand Beit Din that had ever been made, and no Beit Din has been that large since also. And so what are the things that they did? First of all, they put together the siddur. The siddur that we daven with is based on the formulation of Tfilat Shmoneh Esrei that Anshe Knesset HaGdolah put together. Also, they were instrumental in changing the way the world functions in terms of Avodah Zarah not having a central place anymore. That's kind of an extra halachic story. That's something that maybe we can get in some other time. It's a very interesting story. And there were a number of other things that they put into place that really determined the course of the oral law from that point on. So that was at the beginning of Beit Sheni. We're talking about something like 2,600 years ago. And from that point on, we start to see names that we recognize. Those are the first names that we recognize in, for instance, Pirkei Avot, come from that original Beit Din. Also, interesting fact, in that Beit Din, there were 3 Nevi'im. The 3 last Nevi'im, Haggai, Malachi, and Zechariah, who were the last of the Nevi'im from Beit Rishon. We know that Mishin Necharav Beit HaMikdash, Paska Nevuah, right? There was no more Nevuah after the first Beit HaMikdash was destroyed. But those Nevi'im who had begun, what's that bell mean? Those Nevi'im that had already received the Nevuah during Beit Rishon, they continued, they retained it, and we have actually the last Nevuah in Sefer Malachi is about the inauguration of the Mizbeach in Beit Sheni, and they were a part of that Beit Din, and we even have and they were, because they were huge Chachamim as well as being Nevi'im. That's part of the path to becoming a Navi is being Talmid Chacham, and they we have recorded in a couple places in the Gemara, fascinatingly, halachot that were passed down by the Nevi'im, where I don't remember exactly what it's some kind of obscure halacha, but there is a passage where one of the, I think it's Rabban Gamliel or one of the other Tanaim says, al medocha zo, he says, on this stage, the Haggai, the Navi, said these 3 halachot. Like they had this tradition passed down. This is hundreds of years later. This is like 600 years later, but they still knew, they'd preserved that tradition that these halachot had been preserved, had been passed down by this Navi. Very fascinating. So they were part of the oral tradition as well as the Nevi'im. And so the if we look at the beginning of Pirkei Avot, it says, Moshe kibel Torah miSinai, u'mesara liYoshua, Yoshua lizkenim. Where the zkenim? Zkenim were the chachamim that were in that generation, and that zkenim is a continuous kind of the zkenim that were in every generation, until it says zkenim misaru l'anshei knesset agdola. So there was this concept of zkenim, and then there was this phenomenon called Anshe Knesset Agdola that was not the regular Zkenim. The regular Zkenim was probably members of the Sanhedrin in every generation. But all of a sudden, there came into being something called Anshe Knesset Agdola that was not the regular Sanhedrin. And then it says, Shimon HaTzadik hayam mishirurei Anshe Knesset Agdola u'amar shlosha dvarim. So the first thing that is said, we also have Hem Amru Shlosha Dvarim, right? Anshe Knesset Agdola, but the first individual that's mentioned after Moshe and Yoshua in Pirkei Avot is Shimon HaTzadik, who's called Mishirurei or Mishayarei Anshe Knesset Agdola. He was one of the last. He was one of the remaining members. There are 2 opinions about what that means. Some take it literally to mean he was one of the original members and he was one of the last ones that was still alive. Seems unlikely because he lived hundreds of years later. Another explanation I see, which makes a lot more sense, is that he was a part of a Beit Din that was a continuation of the Knesset Agdola. The Knesset Agdola was 120 members. And then as they grew old and passed away, they didn't add any more because the 120 was a one-time thing to have a Beit Din that large. And so as they passed away, nobody was added until they got down to 70, which is the normal size for the Grand Sanhedrin. And then once the 70th member passed away, they started to add on. So that Beit Din was a continuation, and he was a member of that same Sanhedrin that hadn't undergone any changes, but the members had been replaced. And he was one of the members who joined, obviously, some generations later. As opposed to we have stories about the Sanhedrin changing its structure or changing its place. It was originally in the temple, the Lishkat Sanhedrin. That's where they sat. And towards the end of the second temple, they were exiled, and there were a number of different places where the Sanhedrin resided outside of Yerushalayim. So I think the point is that it was the same Beit Din in the same place that had a continuous chain of membership, and it wasn't something that had changed. So we're gonna stop here. There's a lot more to talk about Anshe Knesset Gdola and the kind of transition from Nivu'ah to Chokhmah, the rise, the kind of the descent or the fading away of the Nivu'ah and the rising up of the Chachamim and their power and their significance. We'll get more into